the secret tunnel beneath Berlin no one was supposed to find. Good evening and welcome, wherever you are tonight. Whether the world outside your window is quiet or restless, I hope you can take a moment to settle in, slow your breathing, and allow the noise of the day to gently fade away. This is your time to rest, to listen, and perhaps to reflect. I wish you a peaceful night, one that carries you softly into sleep. Tonight we travel back into the shadows of history, into a divided city, a wounded capital, and a secret buried beneath layers of concrete, fear, and silence. This is a story not often told in full, a story that lingers in the spaces between official records and whispered memory. It is about Berlin, scarred, watchful, and tense during the Cold War, and about something hidden beneath its streets, beneath the rubble rebuilt into order, beneath the watchtowers and barbed wire. There existed a tunnel. Not just any tunnel, but one constructed in secrecy, driven by desperation, intelligence, and the quiet machinery of war conducted in silence. It was not meant to be found, and yet, for a brief moment in time, it existed, alive with purpose, echoing with footsteps, carrying secrets from one side of the world to the other. Tonight, we step carefully into that darkness and listen to what history tried to bury. Let's begin. The story begins in a city that was no longer whole. After the end of World War II, Berlin stood not as a symbol of victory, but as a fracture. A once unified capital had been divided into sectors, controlled by former allies who were quickly becoming adversaries. The streets still carried the dust of bombed buildings, but now a new tension settled over them. Quieter, colder, and far more enduring. In the years that followed, Berlin became something unusual. It was not merely a city, it was a front line. Not in the traditional sense of soldiers advancing across fields, but in a quieter war. One fought with information, surveillance, and mistrust. The Cold War had no single battlefield, but if it did, Berlin would have been its beating heart. On one side, West Berlin, an island of Western influence surrounded entirely by East German territory. On the other, East Berlin, under Soviet control, guarded closely, watched constantly. Movement between the two worlds became increasingly restricted. By the early 1950s, suspicion had hardened into policy. And in this environment, intelligence became everything. The Western powers, particularly the United States and its allies, understood that their greatest disadvantage was not military strength, but visibility. They could not easily see behind the Iron Curtain. They could not hear the conversations happening in offices, barracks, and command centers just a few kilometers away. And in a time when a single decision could shift the balance of power, that silence was dangerous. So they began to listen in the only way they could, carefully, secretly, and beneath the ground. The idea was as simple as it was audacious. If you could not cross the border above, you might pass beneath it. A tunnel, long, narrow, and hidden, could provide access to communication lines deep inside East Berlin. Telephone cables carrying military orders, political discussions, logistical plans, all of it flowing invisibly beneath the surface. If those lines could be reached, they could be tapped. And if they could be tapped, the silence would be broken. Planning such an operation required precision. It required engineers, intelligence officers, and above all, patience. Every meter of soil had to be studied. Every movement had to go unnoticed. Because discovery would not just mean failure. It would mean international scandal, escalation, perhaps even confrontation between nuclear powers. Construction began quietly, almost invisibly in West Berlin. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. A warehouse stood in a relatively unremarkable location. Workers came and went. Supplies were delivered. To anyone watching, it appeared mundane, perhaps even forgettable, but inside something extraordinary was taking shape. The tunnel would stretch hundreds of meters beneath the ground, crossing into East Berlin territory without detection. It had to remain stable, dry, and silent. There could be no vibrations, no signs above ground, no accidental collapse. The soil conditions were difficult, loose, damp, unpredictable. Each section required reinforcement. Each step forward carried risk. And yet, they continued. Day after day, night after night, the tunnel extended further. It was a slow process, almost meditative in its repetition. Dig, support, advance, always in silence, always with the understanding that just above them lay a world that must not know they existed. For the men involved, this was not a battle in the traditional sense. There were no gunshots, no visible enemies, but the tension was constant. Every sound could mean discovery. Every delay could increase the risk. Finally, after months of work, the tunnel reached its destination. Beneath East Berlin, they located the communication cables. And with careful precision, they began to listen. What followed was a flood of information, unlike anything the West had experienced before. Conversations between Soviet military units, East German authorities, logistical commands, all of it now accessible. It was not always dramatic. Often it was routine, procedural, even mundane. But within those details lay patterns, intentions, and insights that had previously been hidden. For intelligence analysts, it was invaluable. For a moment, the balance shifted. But beneath the surface of this success, something else was already unfolding, something unknown to those inside the tunnel, something that would quietly reshape the entire operation. Because in a war defined by secrecy, there is always another layer. And sometimes, the secret you guard most carefully is already known. What the engineers and intelligence officers inside that tunnel did not know was that they were not alone in their knowledge. Somewhere far from the damp earth beneath Berlin, within the quiet corridors of British intelligence, a man had already made a decision, one that would ripple silently through the entire operation. His name was George Blake. To his colleagues, he was a trusted officer, working within the ranks of British intelligence, closely tied to joint operations with the Americans. But in secret, he had chosen another path, ideologically aligned with the Soviet Union. Blake had become a double agent, passing critical information to the East. And among the secrets he handed over was the tunnel. Before a single shovel had broken ground, before the first support beam had been set into place, the Soviets already knew. They knew where the tunnel would begin. They knew where it would end. They understood its purpose. And yet, they did nothing, at least not at first. This is where the story becomes something more than a tale of espionage. It becomes a study in patience, strategy, and quiet calculation. Because instead of exposing the tunnel immediately, an act that would have embarrassed the West and shut the operation down instantly, the Soviet authorities made a different choice. They allowed it to exist. For months, while Western intelligence listened intently to intercepted communications, the Soviets continued to speak across those very same lines. Orders were given, reports were exchanged. Conversations flowed as if nothing had changed. But not all of it was real. Some messages were carefully curated, some details were subtly altered, and others, perhaps the most sensitive, were never spoken on those lines at all. The tunnel, once a powerful tool for gathering truth, had quietly become something else. A channel through which controlled information could pass. It was a mirror, reflecting back what one side wanted the other to see. Inside the tunnel, the work continued. Analysts cataloged recordings, translating, interpreting, building intelligence profiles. To them, it was a triumph, one of the most significant intelligence breakthroughs of the Cold War. They could hear the machinery of their adversary turning, but what they could not hear was the silence where the truth had been removed. Time moved forward as it always does. Seasons changed above ground. Berlin continued its tense existence, divided yet intertwined. And beneath it all, the tunnel remained active, quietly carrying voices across a line that was never meant to be crossed. Then, one night in April 1956, everything changed. East German authorities announced the discovery of the tunnel. Officially, it was presented as a shocking revelation, a violation of sovereignty, an act of espionage uncovered through diligent counterintelligence work. Journalists were invited. Cameras documented the exposed cables, the narrow passageway, the physical evidence of intrusion. The story spread quickly across the world. For the West, it was a humiliation. A secret operation painstakingly constructed, now laid bare for all to see. Questions followed immediately. How had it been discovered? Had there been a mistake, a leak, or simply bad luck? Publicly, there were no clear answers. Privately, the truth remained buried, just like the tunnel itself, because revealing that they had known all along that they had been informed by a double agent within British intelligence would have exposed George Blake, and he was far too valuable to lose. So the Soviets told a different story, one that preserved their advantage, one that maintained the illusion that this had been a victory of vigilance, not a carefully managed deception. And in doing so, they protected their greatest secret, while allowing the West to believe that theirs had simply failed. Years later, the truth would come out. Blake would eventually be exposed, arrested, and his role revealed to the world. The tunnel, once seen as a bold and brilliant operation, would be re-examined under a different light. Not as a simple success or failure, but as something far more complex. A moment where both sides were watching each other, and both believed they understood what they saw. There is something quietly unsettling about that realization, that even in the act of uncovering secrets, we may only be seeing what we are allowed to see. And beneath it all, the tunnel remains, a symbol not just of ingenuity, but of illusion, a reminder that in the shadows of history, truth is rarely as clear as it first appears. Sometimes the deeper you dig, the more uncertain everything becomes. When the tunnel was finally exposed, the world saw only the surface of the story. Photographs circulated in newspapers across Europe and the United States. Images of narrow underground passages, cables laid bare, and uniformed officials standing beside what was presented as a triumph of counterintelligence. The narrative was simple, almost comforting in its clarity. A secret operation had been uncovered, a violation corrected, a line restored. But history rarely rests in simplicity. For those who had worked inside the tunnel, the revelation carried a quieter weight. Months of effort, of careful planning, silent labor, and cautious hope had come to an abrupt end. Yet what lingered was not only disappointment but uncertainty. How much of what they had heard was real? How much had been shaped, redirected, or deliberately offered? Intelligence, once collected, does not simply vanish. It continues to exist, to influence decisions, to shape perceptions. And if that intelligence is flawed, if it has been subtly altered, it can guide actions in ways that are difficult to trace and even harder to correct. In the years that followed, analysts revisited the recordings gathered from beneath Berlin. Conversations were re-examined, patterns reconsidered. What once seemed clear began to blur at the edges. Certain assumptions no longer held. Certain conclusions felt less certain. It was not that everything had been false. Rather, it was that the line between truth and construction had never been fully visible. Above ground, Berlin continued to evolve. In 1961, just a few years after the tunnel's discovery, the city would change again. This time, in a way that couldn't be hidden beneath soil or secrecy. The construction of the Berlin Wall transformed the division into something permanent, something unmistakable. Concrete replaced uncertainty. Barriers replaced ambiguity. Where once there had been movement, however limited, however tense, there was now separation, absolute and enforced. Families were divided overnight. Streets were cut in half. Windows were boarded, doors sealed. Lives interrupted in ways that could not be quietly undone. And beneath it all, the memory of the tunnel faded. Not entirely, but gradually, becoming one of many stories in a city defined by hidden lines and invisible struggles. For some, it remained a symbol of ingenuity, a reminder that even in the most constrained environments, human effort could find a way forward. For others, it stood as a caution, an example of how easily perception can be shaped, how even the most carefully constructed plans can rest on uncertain ground. As the Cold War stretched on, Berlin remained a focal point of that tension, not always in dramatic moments, but in the quiet persistence of division. Guards in watchtowers, lights scanning empty spaces at night, the constant awareness that just beyond sight another system, another ideology, was watching just as closely. And perhaps that is what the tunnel reveals most clearly. Not simply the lengths to which nations will go to understand one another, but the limits of that understanding. The realization that information, no matter how carefully gathered, is never entirely free from interpretation or manipulation. There is a stillness to this kind of history. No explosions, no battles in the traditional sense, just decisions made in quiet rooms, actions taken beneath the surface, and consequences that unfold slowly, almost imperceptibly over time. If you imagine Berlin at night during those years, it is not difficult to picture the silence. A divided city resting uneasily, lights glowing in apartment windows on both sides, people moving through their routines, aware of the boundary, yet continuing forward. And beneath their feet, unseen and largely forgotten, the remnants of a tunnel that once carried voices across that divide. A passage that connected two worlds, if only for a moment. And now, as we look back, it becomes less about the tunnel itself and more about what it represents. The desire to know, the fear of being unknown, and the quiet, persistent tension between truth and illusion that defines so much of human history. Perhaps that is why this story lingers, not because of what was built beneath Berlin, but because of what it reveals about those who built it and those who allowed it to exist. A secret hidden in plain sight, waiting not to be discovered, but to be understood. And even now, long after the tunnel has been filled, sealed, and absorbed back into the earth, its echo remains, soft, distant, but not entirely gone. A reminder that some stories do not end. They simply grow quieter. And now, as this story settles into silence, we return to the present moment. The city above that tunnel has changed. Berlin today is no longer divided by walls or watchtowers. Streets once marked by tension are now filled with movement, conversation, and light. Yet beneath its surface, both physically and in memory, traces of that past remain. History does not disappear. It softens, it fades, but it lingers in quiet ways. The tunnel we've explored tonight was never meant to last. It was built in secrecy, used in uncertainty, and lost in revelation. And yet, in its brief existence, it captured something enduring about the world it belonged to, a time when silence could be as powerful as speech, and when truth itself could be shaped by those who held it. As you prepare to rest, perhaps let that thought drift gently through your mind, not as something heavy, but as something reflective. A reminder that even in the darkest, most uncertain moments of history, there were always people listening, thinking, questioning, trying to understand a world that often refused to be fully known. Thank you for spending this time here in quiet reflection. Wherever you are tonight, I hope you feel a sense of calm, of stillness, and of distance from the noise of the day. Sleep well, and may your night be peaceful.